Just to say a little bit about Tom, which is that he was actually born in London. Both his parents, James and Hilda Kirsch, were part of the first Jungian professional group in the 1930s here. He's practiced as an analyst in California for more than 30 years and is a past president of the C.G. Jung Institute in San Francisco, and also vice president and president of the IAAP at one time, and a fellow of the American Academy of Psychoanalysis. He is an advisor to the Journal of Analytical Psychology, has written numerous papers on historical topics in analytical psychology, on dreams, and on the analytic process. I've also put together a few copies of Tom's full publications, which are here. There are about 3 or 4 copies if anyone wants to look up in greater detail. But again, if you wouldn't mind just leaving them on the table once you've finished with them. Tom has lectured in many countries. To name a few: South Africa, Korea, Brazil, Mexico, Switzerland, and of course the United States. He is currently engaged in writing a book on the history of analytical psychology for Routledge, and the tentative title, he's just told me, is The Jungians. Tom's talk today is on the origins of analytical psychology in the UK, particularly on Michael Fordham's relationship to Jung and on Fordham's work in founding the Society of Analytical Psychology. He wrote an obituary on Fordham for the Journal of Analytical Psychology. As Tom knows the UK analytic situation well from his frequent visits here, he has developed the perspective on that particular scene of both the insider and the outsider, which interestingly enough was a theme I gave a paper on here to the analytic group just a few months ago. Tom.
Should I stand? Yes. It is, I'm very nervous speaking before this august group. This is a first for me in a number of ways. First of all, it's the first time I've spoken in England to this group. Secondly, it's having spent my infancy less than 2 miles from here, it's really in some sense a return home. So, and the third thing I'm going to ask from you is that this is also the first time I'm presenting the particular material that I'm going to present today, and it's actually part of the book that I'm working on. And it may be a little bit long, and I hope that I've with some suggestions, I've tried to pare it down. But the history of analytical psychology in Great Britain is one of the more stirring, divisive, and interesting topics. And I hope, as I see there are certain people in the audience who have lived through it, I hope that I'm not going to step on anybody's toes as I give you my version of what's happened, as how I've seen it. And I would like to thank the SAP and Mrs. Fuller and Andrew Samuels for inviting me. Now, the history, for me, it's been a very important experience through history to trace the origins of analytical psychology. Because as psychotherapists and analysts, we are all aware of history in our analytical work. And Jung himself was most interested in history, in the history of the psyche. And when one reads him, it is interesting to see how often he will trace the origins and the historical aspects of the subject. And it is a bit presumptive of me to come here to England and try and tell you what has happened here. but I will I will do that anyway. As you know, my parents were part of the very early professional scene here from 1930 to 1940, and I will speak a little bit later about my mother's unique role in that. And I was vice president from 1977 through 1989 of the IAAP at a time when there were a lot of divisions and tensions going on here. And so I got quite immersed in the various things that were going on here. First of all, I would like to start a little bit with Jung himself. Jung was a frequent visitor to the United Kingdom, and in addition, during most of his lifetime, England and the UK had close contacts. And I just read recently that Jung studied English at Berlitz School when he was a student in Paris in 1903. So that I was always wondering where he got his English. This is from Ellenberger, so that's of interest to me. Now, although the connections between the two countries have been always very close, the presentation of Jung in England took on a very definite British flavor. For over 500 years, the British and the continent had a long history of differences of philosophical attitude. British empiricism from Francis Bacon, John Locke, David Hume in the 17th and 18th century, coming forward to John Stuart Mill in the 19th century, and logical positivism in the 20th, was grounded in an empiricism which did not place a great deal of emphasis on inborn human structures. The notion of the tabula rasa, or blank screen, was very strong in British empiricism. And during the lifetimes of David Hume and Immanuel Kant in the late 18th century, a fierce battle raged on the nature of reality. Was there an intrinsic, a priori, predetermined reality, or was reality only a probability which could be reaffirmed anew by observation? And the argument raged over whether one could know with certainty if the sun was going to rise the next day. This, Kant would say that this was known for sure, for certainty, whereas Hume said it was only very highly probable, based on previous observation. The argument was never settled in their lifetimes, and in a sense it has not been settled to this day. Now one might ask, what does this have for the significance for our present query? And I will say a great deal. Jung was steeped in Kant's philosophy, and his hypothesis of the collective unconscious and archetypes drew heavily on Kant's notion of the synthetic a priori and the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. Thus, it was inevitable that Jung's ideas would have to undergo some changes upon entering British soil. And that's what we shall be doing today, in order to make Jung's ideas more compatible to the English traditions. Now, Jung's first professional visit to England occurred in July of 1914, when he was invited to give an address to the annual general meeting of the British Medical Society in Aberdeen, Scotland. His lecture on the importance of the unconscious in psychopathology elaborated his theory of psychic compensation. The Great War broke out while he was in Scotland, and he and Emma had a very difficult time returning to Switzerland. After the war, he gave another paper on the psychogenesis of mental illness to the section of psychiatry, the Royal Society of Medicine. Then in 1920, he experimented first here in England with the seminar format. which he was to use for the remainder of his professional life. It proved to be highly successful, and so he continued to use this seminar. Thus began a series of visits which lasted until the onset of World War II. He gave a seminar in 1920, another one in 1923 in Cornwall, and another again in 1925. And all three seminars were given to an Alezans and students of his. In 1935, it was probably Jung's most famous visit when he gave the Tavistock lectures just down the hall to a group of skeptical doctors, psychologists, psychoanalysts, and psychiatrists. The attendees were mostly critical at the start, but by the end of his fifth and final lecture, the majority of them in attendance had been deeply touched by Jung's wit, charm, and intelligence. Now, that was to be, Jung's last visit was in 1938 at the time of the International Congress of Psychotherapy. He got invited again in 1959, but by then was too ill to attend. Now, the first Jungian group, it was an informal one, and it began during the Great War. None of these people were to remain with Jung, as they either became followers of Gurdjieff or returned to Freudian psychoanalysis. An analytical psychology club, modeled on the format of the Zurich Club, was formed and held its first meeting September 15, 1922. And it was at the home of Esther Harding, an English physician. There were 5 doctors in attendance, including Doctors Mary Bell, Helen Shaw, Adela Wharton, and Godwin Baines, in addition to Esther Harding. Dr. Baines became the acknowledged leader of the club, as well as the leading spokesman for Jung in Britain. Now, shortly thereafter, Esther Harding joined Eleanor Bertin in New York and became the leading Jungian in the United States for almost the next 50 years. Just think how differently analytical psychology would have developed had she remained in Great Britain. Jung was the man in her life, and her intellectual work reflects a language similar to his own. As Peter Baines was a seminal figure in England, let us talk a little bit more about him. He was born in 1882 and trained in medicine. After World War I, he became interested in Jung's psychology and went to Zurich to have a period of analysis. And from 1922 until 1943, he represented Jung's ideas at the Society for Psychical Research, the British Institute of Philosophical Studies, and other groups which wished to have Jung's point of view. Furthermore, Baines became the first assistant to Jung, and he organized Jung's safari to Africa. His translations of psychological types, contributions to analytical psychology, and in collaboration with his third wife, Carrie Baines, 2 essays on analytical psychology, were for many years the main works of Jung in English. He also published 2 books of his own, Mythology of the Soul and Germany Possessed. The latter brought him into the eyes of the public. The former was a huge opus of amplificatory material on 2 cases in the manner of Jung himself. One of the cases was unfortunately identifiable as Michael Fordham, which was a lifelong difficulty for Michael. Now, at the same time that he used Fordham as a case, Baines was grooming him to take over the leadership of the English Jungians upon his own death. When Baines did die suddenly of a heart attack in 1943, Fordham did have to take on the mantle without much warning. Baines was an extroverted feeling man. He ended up being married 4 times, And again, one can only speculate how differently analytical psychology might have been had Baines lived longer. Furthermore, he was an excellent representative to both the professional and public aspect of Jung's views. I think that the rapprochement with psychoanalysis that began in the 1940s would have been different and slower had Baines lived longer. Now, the Analytical Psychology Club grew quickly from the initial 5 in 1922 to approximately 25 members. And originally, all members of the club had to be analyzed by either Jung or Tony Wolff. However, this quickly changed so that analysis and recommendation from any qualified Jungian analyst, which were very few, became the requirement. There were regular discussions, lectures, a large library, and the club had its questions about how to relate, what was the, how to relate as a group, what was the relationship of individuation to group processes, and what should be the purpose of the club. Baines was the leader, and he was not comfortable with the constant comparison to Jung. By 1935, there were 5 analysts practicing in London. In addition to Baines, there was Dr. Helen Shaw, Culver Barker, Michael Fordham, and a lay analyst, Elsie Beckinsale. 1936, a medical society of analytical psychology was formed within the club. And this separation of the medical analysts produced a tension. The lay analysts at the time formed their own group within the club, and then within a short period of time, they joined to form the Society of Practicing Analysts. This is not the Society of Analytical Psychology. Now, meanwhile, others fleeing the Nazis, such as my parents, Gerhard and Hella Adler, Werner Rosenbaum, would soon enter the scene. So by the end of the 1930s, there were 12 analysts in London. There was no separate organization, but they were all part of the growing Analytical Psychology Club. Now, in 1939, the analysts under Fordham were able to formulate standards for training, which had the approval of Zurich, and which were presented to the medical section of the British Psychological Society. But then the Second World War intervened, and nothing further was done about these issues until after the war. Well, actually during the war, 1944, when Fordham proposed a center for analytical psychology. By 1943, the British Medical Association had begun to lay down guidelines for physical and mental health, and Fordham had sensed this was the time for a professional organization of analytical psychologists which could relate to the collective structures. He viewed this as still being connected to the club, the Analytical Psychology Club, and not separate from it. However, the center never came into being. Instead, in 1945, the Society of Analytical Psychology was incorporated. The founding members included Barker, Robert Moody, Fordham, Adler, Methman, Lola Paulson, and Mrs. Fordham. And a clinic was formed, and it was decided that the chair of this council had to be a medical person. In the early years of the SAP, many prominent psychiatrists entered the training, and the prestige of Jungian analysis was on the rise. A special mention should be made of E.A. Bennett, a psychiatrist who was a lecturer at the Maudsley, one of the most famous psychiatric and psychoanalytic institutions at that time. Bennett was able to introduce Jung's concept to the students who came from around the world. Through his influence, many psychiatrists such as Alan Edwards, Robert Hobson, David Howell, Gordon Prince, Leopold Stein, and Anthony Storr all entered training in the SAP. Bennett was special in another way. He and his wife had a close personal relationship with the Jungs. Whenever he would go to Zurich, he and his wife would either stay with the Jungs or at least meet with the Jungs. And whenever Jung came to England, Bennett would make all the travel arrangements for them. This, as you can imagine, produced some jealousy and envy among others. Bennett clearly was a favorite of Jung's, and that cannot be denied. There was a special conflict between Bennett and Fordham, which Bennett left and withdrew from the SAP in the early 50s. By the late 1950s, Fordham reached out with an olive branch and Bennett returned. But then in 1963, he resigned for good. The period between 1946 and 1953 have been described as the halcyon days. That's your description. The war was over, professional lives could develop, there was relative harmony, and the SAP began to grow at a rapid rate. Twice weekly analysis for trainees was required, and the divisiveness which was to arise over frequency of sessions and transference had not yet developed. By the late 1950s, training requirements were changed to stipulate a minimum of 3 times a week analysis, greater emphasis on infancy and early childhood, and the analysis of transference and countertransference. Furthermore, active imagination, amplification, and other such classical methods became less frequently used. Archetypal symbolism was found in relationship to the body of the analyst rather than to impersonal symbolic images. The instinctual aspect of the archetype was emphasized. Fordham's deintegration and reintegration became the discussion of the day. Now, the first occasion where these differences were aired publicly occurred at the Second International Congress for Analytical Psychology in Zurich in 1962. That Congress, Murray Jackson gave a paper on what is the nature of symbol. And of all people, Esther Harding was the discussant for that paper. And she stated flatly in her discussion that Dr. Murray Jackson had not understood at all what Jung meant by the term symbol. You can see this if you look at the published as the archetype edited by Guggenbuhl. After she spoke, these Jung Institute students who were in attendance clapped wildly and stamped their feet in approval. So the tension which had been developing between, quote, the London attitude and Zurich point of view had finally come out in the open. A division, soon to be named London and Zurich schools, ensued. The London school became the developmental school, but in 1962, most analytical psychologists supported the Zurich point of view. Murray Jackson, devastated by the experience, left the SAP to follow non-Jungian paths. In retrospect, I find it curious that Esther Harding, the quintessential English person, representing Jung and the continent over against Murray Jackson. Any of you who knew Esther Harding knew she was she was not somebody to cross lightly. Now, what happened then is that the journal, Fordham became the editor of the Journal of Analytical Psychology in 1955, and he began to present the developmental point of view. This did not occur immediately. The first 3 or 4 years, if you look at the journal, the journal carried many themes which would be considered more classical themes. However, in the late 1950s, the journal took on, quote, a more scientific and clinical approach. Papers on more traditional Jungian themes were no longer welcome. And this editorial policy continued for most of the next 15 years in which Fordham was the editor. When Fred Plaut took over the editorship of the journal in 1971, he introduced a more eclectic attitude towards papers written for the journal, and that policy has only grown over the years. The emphasis, as you all know, remains on clinical issues, but there's a much wider spectrum of material. By then, the developmental school had made its mark, and many Jungians, most Jungians, had come to see the importance of that perspective. The tradition of the developmental approach and a training with emphasis in early development had become established fact. Now, as the developmental approach became more firmly established, those analysts and candidates who held a more classical Jungian approach began to feel excluded. This tension has often been described as a personal one between Fordham and Adler. Fordham denied that it was personal, but that it was instead a difference in outlook. Adler complained that his trainees were not acceptable at the SAP and that his seminars were badly attended. Over the years, the tension between the two positions mounted, and by 1975, Adler and his followers were ready to form their own group. They desired a place where the more traditional Jungian positions would be valued. The conflict bore some resemblance to the one encountered in the British psychoanalysis between Melanie Klein and Anna Freud. The British psychoanalytic, as you all know, ended up by developing 3 sections within one group. Thus, a split was averted. Now, in 1975 and 1976, 5 meetings took place to see if a compromise similar to that done by the psychoanalysts could be worked out. Eventually, Adler stated that his hurt and anger towards the SAP were too great and that he needed to invest his energy into the founding of a new group, which was to be called the Association of Jungian Analysts, and at first it had alternative training. The SAP gave its blessing, and it was encouraged by the IAP Executive Committee. Both returning Zurich graduates and English analysts of a more classical persuasion needed to find their own place. In 1977, AJA came into existence at the Congress in Rome. Let me just tell you a little bit about the two protagonists, although it was not personal. Gerhard Adler was born in Berlin of German Jewish extraction. He began his analysis with James Kirsch in 1929 in Berlin, and from 1931 to 1934 he was in analysis with Jung. In 1936 he and his wife Hella fled to England to escape Nazi persecution. He had a PhD in psychology and was one of the non-medical analysts in the SAP. His book, Studies in Analytical Psychology, written in 1948, was widely read as an introduction to Jung's psychology. He wrote another book, The Living Symbol, which is a long case study, which for me is not as convincing because he only writes about 6 months of the case. He was the co-editor of the published letters of Jung and editor of the collected works. and from 1971 to 1977, a 2-term president of the IAEP. When Aja developed splits within its own organization later on, he devoted most of his remaining energy to sifting out the thorny issues involved. He no longer published any articles or books, and his role in the ensuing split within Aja left his reputation somewhat tarnished at the end. Although he received wide support from the international Jungian community in his struggles with Fordham, when similar political battles occurred within Aja, there was a real shift, generally speaking, in the international Jungian community towards Adler. He was always considered a close collaborator and friend of Jung. The other protagonist, Michael Fordham, is recognized throughout the Jungian world, was the acknowledged leader of analytical psychology in England for over 50 years. He was born in 1905 to a family of landowners, the youngest of 3 children. His father was in local politics, and his mother, whom he adored, had trained to be an opera singer. She died as a result of an asthmatic attack when Michael was 15, and family life as he had known it came to an end. He went on to study medicine and physiology at Cambridge University, and through Peter Baines, a friend of the family, he was introduced to Jung's writings. In 1933, Fordham began a short 7-month analysis with Baines. And then in 1934, Fordham traveled to Zurich with the idea of having analysis with Jung and working to pay for it. However, he found when he got there that he was not able to work in Switzerland, and so he couldn't afford to stay there and have analysis with Jung. Instead, he returned to London, had another short stint with Baines, and then wrote to Jung that he would like to change analysts and see Hilda Kirsch, whom he had met at meetings of the Analytical Psychology Club. At the time he approached her for analysis, she was a nursing mother. That was me. And she had never seen a single person in analysis. Thus, Michael Fordham not only became her first analytical patient, but was also Jung's way of acknowledging her and accrediting her as an analyst. Now, the analysis continued until 1940, when, on short notice, during the Battle of Britain, our family emigrated to the United States. That's when I lost my British accent. Fordham probably had 3 years of once-a-week analysis, which came then to a very sudden termination. One does not know what went on in the analysis. Fordham states in his autobiography that as one part of the analysis, that when he was developing an erotic transference towards his analyst, she handled it by inviting him for dinner to meet her husband. Now, my mother never spoke about any of her analyses in front of us children, so I have no further information what happened. Thus, Fordham had this one very public analysis written up for posterity in a book by Baines, the other quite personal and foreshortened by the exigencies of the war. When our family left England in October of 1940, this concluded Michael's formal Jungian analysis and training. The combination of events that directed Fordham's personal analysis influenced him deeply. When most of his other first-generation colleagues and friends were in analysis with Jung, Fordham was denied this experience. Thus, although there is little question that he had a strong positive projection onto Jung, it was not the idealized transference that the others had. He loved and respected Jung very much, but he did not have the direct experience of analysis with him. He always felt somewhat outside that close inner circle. And one can only wonder about the envy and jealousy which must have colored his relationship both to Adler and to Bennett, both of whom, following their personal analysis, had close personal relationships to Jung. On the other hand, when Jung sought someone to be the general editor of the collected works in English, he chose Fordham above the others. There's a further issue complicating Fordham's analysis. As I've mentioned, Fordham had very little money at the time, and so as a form of payment, Fordham agreed to allow his paintings and dreams to be published in Baynes's book. And the description which made him identifiable, he was also described in that book as schizophrenic, which is untrue. Fordham may have been borderline as a young man, but his subsequent development and genius showed that he had mastered his most severe psychopathology. And the fact that he was identifiable in this book proved to be a lifelong liability, which he could not undo. Furthermore, his second analyst, Hilda Kirsch, suddenly left England during the war, repeating the sudden loss of his mother. There are several pieces of evidence that hint that this was a most important experience for him. James Astor's excellent book, Michael Fordham, reports his analysis ended in 1939. I have written to him to correct it that it went on until October of 1940. Secondly, when I first met Michael as an adult at my first Jungian Congress here in London in 1971, we shook hands. He says, "Now I've met my rival." I mean, it was humor, but I picked up something more in it. After my mother's death in 1978, we had a discussion about his analytic work with her. As you can imagine, although he said it was not analysis, because, I mean, it was once a week, and et cetera, he described it in generally positive terms as having helped to put his ego together and his life in order. And I would say one can only wonder how much his own analytic experience influenced his later developing alternative interpretations and methods of analysis. His experience of the transference in both of his analyses was that it was not contained. The termination phase of the analysis with my mother was never adequately dealt with. However, on the other side, his not ever being in a proper analysis with Jung left him more free to explore psychoanalysis without a feeling of disloyalty. In those early days, the Jung-Freud split was extremely hot, and one crossed party lines at one's own peril. Quite different from today, where crossover is almost routine. Now, after World War II, Fordham came into his own. He spearheaded the founding of the SAP, became general editor of the collected works, founded the Journal of Analytical Psychology, and was active in the medical section of the British Psychological Society. And he formed leading professional relationships with the leading psychoanalysts of the day, such as Winnicott and Bion, and became chair of the medical section in 1962. Fordham's significance for analytical psychology is profound. His organizational talents in founding both an adult and child training remains monumental. He introduced infant observation in the training of child analysis. His interactions with psychoanalysis have had a mutually long-lasting beneficial result, with the inclusion in the theory of analytical psychology of many insights from psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic technique. I would say from my experience, the majority of analytical psychologists in England practice a mixture of analytical psychology and object relations. And it's as the result of the pioneering efforts of Michael Fordham. His theory of child development has permeated analytical psychology. The work on the syntonic and illusory aspects of transference and countertransference have been generally accepted. Thus, as a pioneer, he's been an administrator and politician, teacher and trainer, as well as an innovator in theory and practice. His leadership qualities were recognized very early when he was already made chairman of the Analytical Psychology Club at age 30. Fordham evoked powerful reactions, both positively and negatively. He often described himself as an enfant terrible, and he could be extremely provocative at meetings. His status within the worldwide Jungian community took a dip during the late 50s and the early 60s, when he championed the developmental against the classical. He became extremely critical of the classical and when he would not publish articles which espoused it. I think the problem with what Fordham did at that time was that Fordham did not acknowledge that he had changed his views from a more, quote, conventional Jungian to one which explicitly included British object relations theory. By the mid-1970s, the pendulum had swung back towards favoring Fordham. His work had begun to be more widely accepted, and he sensed that he was no longer the maverick. As he aged, his position, he expressed more appreciation towards all aspects of analytical psychology. He was asked frequently why he had remained a Jungian, when it seemed that his theories were more consonant with object relations theory. He always replied that he was Jungian and that he was extending Jung's researches. Then with a twinkle in his eye, he would say, it wouldn't look very good if the founder of analytical psychology in England defected to another school, would it? That was actually the last time I saw him in November of 1994. Fordham was destined to find his own individual path, and by the time of his death in 1995, his status as one of the truly great pioneers in analytical psychology was ensured. Now let us move on to 1977, when AJA was officially accepted as a training institute. Because from 1977 to 1981, they had their halcyon days. And the two populations within AJA, the London and the Zurich, cohabited harmoniously, with the Adlers as the acknowledged leaders. However, in 1982, a serious problem developed when a long-standing member applied to become a training analyst was turned down. Another long-standing member who wished to become a training analyst feared the same outcome, said if the first one was not made a training analyst, there would be all-out war. And that there was. The new division with AJA also displayed a London-Zurich split. The London-trained analysts within AJA were more clinically based, advocating 3 times a week analysis, emphasis on transference, and strict boundaries in the analytic setting. However, to distinguish themselves from SAP, they were theoretically aligned with the classical prospective approach to the unconscious over an emphasis on infancy. On the other hand, the Zurich-trained members of AJA did not specify 3 times a week analysis, nor was transference analysis as central to their work as it was to the London-trained members. The Zurich-trained people utilized a model that Jung himself had used in the early days of analytical psychology, one which was still prevalent at that time in Zurich. A further issue, and I'm very familiar with this, which occurs in every country where there is an already existing Jungian training, when the reception of Zurich diploma candidates returned. These returning diplomates from Zurich had to see a case under supervision and attend monthly meetings for a year before being assessed by a professional committee. This was not easily accepted by the Zurich-trained analysts who had just undergone a most rigorous academic training and did not feel they should be submitted to yet another examination upon their return to their home country. This appeared to them as a criticism of their training. Thus there was a London-Zurich split within Asia. So in 1982, at the annual general meeting, the time was to elect a new chairman. The split was exactly down the middle, and there were 12 members voting on each side, and proxies from people as far away as Israel were gotten, and no amicable decision could be reached between the two factions. And that the hostility among the senior members, who were evenly divided, was extremely intense. Now, in 1983, at the IAAP Congress, the IAAP Executive Committee, of which I was at this point on it, took up the issue, and members of each side presented their views. In the end, the IAAP Executive Committee recommended suspension for Asia until a resolution between the two factions could be reached. Since I was I was vice president and I was the native English speaker, I was the one who spoke to representatives both before and after the suspension and to members of the SAP as well as the various. I think my head was buzzing. So for the next 3 years, I didn't know what was going to happen. The next Congress was in Berlin in 1986. So when I flew over 1986 to Berlin, I wondered what would be the outcome. To my complete shock and surprise, a solution had been reached where Asia and now a new group called the Independents would have their own groups, but to my complete surprise, a fourth group was added to the mix, the BAP, which had wished to join IAP for many years but had not found suitable conditions to make an application, now applied. The turmoil within Asia was the stimulus that BAP needed to make their own application. The SAP supported the application as the British Psychoanalytic Society had been acting in a parallel fashion for the Freudian section for BAP. The compromise was worked out behind the scenes, and I still don't know with whom, with selected members of BAP, SAP, and Dr. Diekmann, then president of the IAP. The symmetry of the situation, the number 4, so important in Jungian circles, was found to be an agreeable solution, and the IAP delegates readily accepted the plan and accredited the 4 professional societies. At that Congress in Berlin, Asia was reinstated, and the Independents and BAP Union section were voted in as separate societies. Now, IGAP and Asia are approximately half the size of the SAP or BAP. So then there was an umbrella group, where these 4 groups could meet and discuss things of mutual concern. The reasons why these splits occur in psychoanalytic circles are unclear. Unfortunately, they are rather common. We can talk about differences in ideology, clinical practice, personalities, plus power issues. Power is very important. And each developing society, when it begins, has a problem with incest. And the founding mothers and fathers of any society, a professional society, take on a number of roles. The boundaries are not clear. That includes analyst, supervisor, teacher, and often some important role with significant others of the candidates and the new analysts. And how the founders play out this role is crucial. The question is whether the founders can let go of the authority as the younger analysts grow and develop is an absolutely central point. And in the English situation, one can think of the Jung-Fordham relationship. Many of the classical analysts at the first International Congress in 1958, it was clear already at that point that Fordham was developing his own ideas that were quite different terms than Jung in the classical point of view. And many of the classical analysts thought that Fordham was no longer Jungian and that some action already then in 1958 should be taken against him. However, Jung was open to Fordham's innovations and encouraged others like von Franz and Barbara Hanna to leave him alone. Jung realized that his students needed to find their own paths just as he had done in relationship to Freud. Now, I would say that that kind of development was not possible within Asia. And so part of the struggles were a result of that. I'm almost finished. As I've said, most analysts here, from my experience, practice some hybrid of analytical psychology and object relations. Those who practice a more classical Jungian approach are in the minority. The political issues of how all analytical psychologists can be under one umbrella has not been settled. And let me say something else, and this is very important. The developments in England have foreshadowed similar events in other countries. And I think that England is the leader and innovator for this. Because of Fordham's individual relationship both to Jung and to psychoanalysis, these events occurred in England perhaps 2 decades earlier than in other countries. Now, what does this say for the future of analytical psychology? Will we become a sub-branch of psychoanalysis? Exploration of the psyche will continue in some form or another. One aspect of Jung which is so important to me is that he has always presented his ideas in a historical context. He relates his research traditions to traditions that go back thousands of years. And in that context, the continuity of the psyche is assured. Whether we or succeeding generations will be practicing, quote, Jungian analysis, or will be called analytical psychologists, or Jungian psychoanalysts, or some form of spiritual analysis, who can say? Analytical psychology has developed in England in a way that has been consistent with its own cultural, philosophical, and scientific past. And the attitudes and values which are expressed by analytical psychologists in England are a vital part of the world community of Jungians. Perhaps to those of you who are in everyday practicing analysts, this perspective can become blurred. But I would say that the groups here in England play a very vital role in the international Jungian community at this time. Thank you.